Fire and...
I'm Liz Neisloss. Tonight on Greater Boston, the efforts to arm Ukraine as Russia prepares to ramp up its attacks, and the tensions mounting over American and German tanks. Is this the moment needed to propel Ukraine to victory? Then later this week, the Boston Festival of Films features film from Iran, and we'll have the director of This Is Not Me, a film about two trans men fighting for care and recognition in Iran. As Ukraine reels from the latest Russian attacks, including one on a residential building that killed more than 40 people, the U.S. and other NATO allies are preparing to send a huge package of heavy weapons to help the country push back against Kremlin forces. The package includes new air defenses, new armored vehicles, and around a dozen British tanks. But so far, the U.S. and Germany have been hesitant to send their top-line tanks, despite warnings that Russia is expected to ramp up its attacks in the coming months, and pleas from Ukraine's president.
Tragedies are outpacing life. The tyranny is outpacing the democracy. Russia needed less than 1 second to start the war. The world needed days to react with first sanctions. The time the free world uses to think is used by the terrorist state to kill. The world must not hesitate.
So why are the tanks that Ukraine says it needs the big issue? And will that even be enough to beat back Russia's advances in the months to come? Joining me to help break this all down are Carol Saivetz, a senior advisor at MIT's Security Studies program and a research associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and Emily Channell-Justice, director of the Temerte Contemporary Ukraine Program at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. Carol, let's start with you. Why are tanks the focus of the moment?
I think tanks are the focus of the moment because there's, if you remember, the war started on February 24th, so there's a lot of anticipation of a renewed Russian offensive within the next several weeks, months, whatever. And the feeling is that the tanks that Ukraine has actually been asking us for all along are the way to halt that next forthcoming attack. The interesting thing to me is that I think Biden has been very careful and sort of equilibrating, I guess, not getting to a point where we're engaged directly with Russia. On the other hand, obviously helping the Ukrainians. The last I saw this afternoon was that the Germans have sort of said to the Poles, well, you can go ahead and export the tanks. We won't stop you, but we're not giving them.
Right.
So,
and Carol, we should say that, I mean, a decision may be made between, now and later this evening.
Right.
But this seems to be a moment, Emily, where we're talking about a principle. As President Zelensky essentially said, stop bargaining about numbers. It's time to open up a principle of supply. What does that mean?
Well, what President Zelensky really wants to see is all of Ukraine's NATO allies taking the same line, because that, I think, is what would really show Vladimir Putin once and for all that the West is on Ukraine's side and that Russia cannot win. And so while certainly Zelensky is going to be very happy with the tanks that countries like Poland have already committed to giving, as well as the increased support from Finland, Estonia, some of Ukraine's other smaller allies, having German support, for example, goes a really long way in showing that united front and showing that these allies will really stop at nothing to help Ukraine win this war.
So, Carol, what's behind Germany's hesitation? We should explain also, by the way, that Germany can export its own tanks, but they need to give permission to Poland to re-export what they have given Poland. These are the Leopard 2s.
Exactly. Which is why it was important when the Germans stated today that they wouldn't block Poland from exporting the tanks to Ukraine. There was no explicit permission. It's kind of like with a wink and a nod, please go right ahead. We're not going to do it. I think there are two issues here. I think that there's this long history of Germany, and I'm not a German expert, but long history of Germany wanting to engage with Russia. Think back to Willy Brandt and the Ostpolitik and everything else, and they're very hesitant to be out there sort of in front of of everybody else. The Germans are also the most dependent on Russian oil and natural gas. And even though they have done very well in trying to reduce that dependence, I think they're afraid that they could trigger even more significant reductions in Russian supply. I think ultimately they will come along. I think that there's a lot of pressure on Scholz to supply the tanks. And let's not forget, to go back, Liz, to something that you said before, the British are also supplying their top-of-the-line tanks to Ukraine as well. So it may not be as much as Ukraine would like, but I think that there's certainly going to be more than there is now. And hopefully that would hold off any kind of Russian offensive. And we are sending any number of strikers of different kinds of military vehicles, just not the M1 tank.
So logistics was raised by the U.S., fuel supply as a reason, one of the reasons they were not going to be supplying the tanks. But the Russians also seem to acknowledge logistics problems with tanks. It seemed like a sort of unusual thing for the Russians to say, well, you're going to have trouble with all that anyway, almost acknowledging their own problems. Carol, do you see something unique in that?
You know, the Russian army turned out not to be the army that we all thought it was going to be, as we saw certainly last year and throughout the fall. I think the issue, and I forget which is which, I'm sorry, that the U.S. tanks use a different kind of fuel from the Leopards, and there are repair stations already established to repair the Leopards if they're damaged during the war, and there isn't such a system in place for the U.S. tanks. So
it is more complicated than people would assume. It's not just lob some heavy-duty equipment. There's a lot that goes along with it. Yeah. So, Emily, some people look at this situation and might say, why string this out? If the Ukrainians are properly supplied, this can all come to an end much faster. So from your perspective, why does this need to be a delicate dance at this point?
Well, I think there's still a lot of conversations, especially in Europe, about what will prompt Vladimir Putin to end this war. Emmanuel Macron himself, the French president, has been hesitant. He's been one who's mentioned kind of giving Putin an off-ramp, certainly ramping up the military aid for Ukraine is sort of indicating that Europe no longer has any interest in providing an off-ramp. And so I think it's to some extent not cutting off any options. However, I think that the European leaders are also starting to understand that Putin could stop this war at any point. Russia could stop this war at any point, and they are choosing not to. And in fact, we're most likely to see a ramping up of the Russian offensive either, around the anniversary of the war or sometime in the spring, potentially. So I think it's also, there's a more of an understanding that the support for Ukraine needs to be more definitive. Ukraine's Western allies need to be more united, and hopefully that will, not only prevent damage from, further aerial strikes, civilian targets, infrastructural targets that we've been seeing over the course of the past few months, but it would potentially make it a lot easier when the time comes for Ukraine's offensive to retake those territories that still are occupied by Russia. Ukraine would have an advantageous position and could then take those territories back much more easily.
But, you talk about Putin. Putin has shown no willingness to back down. Quite the contrary. He wants to restore the former Soviet Union. He's threatening the former Warsaw Pact members. But they, in turn, seem to be doubling down in a way. There's a host of countries who are digging in, Poland is ramping up its production of weapons. How do you interpret now, Emily, how do you interpret the spillover effect on these former Warsaw Pact countries?
Well, these are the countries that know intimately what it would be like to have Russia, first of all, kind of control their whole political economic system. They know that from experience, but they also are the closest to Ukraine. They know what would happen if Russia wins in Ukraine. Poland will be next. I mean, I think it's really, this is something we talked about a lot, I think, at the very beginning of the war. And as it's become entrenched, we've stopped thinking about the great geopolitical threat that we're seeing now. But I still believe that if Russia somehow manages to take over Ukraine, which I really don't think is likely at this point. But if they do, and if they believe that they can, then democracies like Poland will be next. The Baltic countries will be under threat next. And so I think these countries they're doing just a really admirable job of advocating for Ukraine on behalf of Ukraine to the other countries that have more economic and military power to support Ukraine. I think they really understand on an existential level what is at stake here.
Okay, well, Carol, right now we don't seem to be at a moment where we're talking about peace. But should the question of pursuing peace, has that been totally lost? It doesn't seem to be the moment for that. But what is the answer to those who still say we should be pursuing peace?
I honestly don't know how you pursue peace at the moment. The Russians are clearly not interested in any kind of peace negotiations. At the point, I guess in December, when Putin listed a bunch of priorities, and then the Ukrainians did as well, there was no overlap at all between the minimal conditions for even starting negotiations. And I think Emily is absolutely right. At this point, it's become much more of a I'm not sure existential is the right word, but it's become much more of a philosophical fight about democracy and about not wanting to succumb to the authoritarian government and the brutality of the Russian regime at the moment.
And another thing we haven't heard that much about, Emily, are migrants. There has been a massive outflow of Ukrainian migrants, but Russia may be pursuing this strategy, this pressure on civilians. Ukrainian civilians seem to be withstanding a lot of this. But do you think that is a targeted attempt to destabilize in some way? Russia could be pushing on the migrant issue, attacking civilians more, finding other ways to undermine European support through the pressure of migrants?
Absolutely. I think there are two parts to the way of looking at this question. Certainly there's this push to hit civilian infrastructure in an attempt to demoralize Ukrainians, make them less likely to keep fighting. I don't think this is a strategy that's working. From what I'm hearing from people who have remained in Ukraine, they're just as apt to continue the fight however they can. Certainly they're exhausted. They would like this war to be over, but that tactic hasn't worked. So what I would maybe anticipate is really a kind of Russian disinformation push to start targeting those large migrant populations in countries like Poland, in countries like Germany, to try to somehow present those Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine and who are still refugees right now, present them as some kind of a problem or some kind of a drain on the system in the European countries that are hosting them. Again, I'm not sure that a tactic like that will work, because those countries, and especially their civilians, have really united around helping Ukrainians. But at this point, I wouldn't be surprised to see Russia use, whatever informational tactics they can to try to stir up sentiment, especially now that they see European leaders turning a little bit more aggressively against Russia, right? They want to make sure that there's some public opinion that still supports Russia. And I think we're seeing that disappear over the course of the past few months.
And Carol, how do you interpret moves from a country like France, which is now announcing they want to modernize their military? They're going to make good on the 2% contribution commitment to NATO. It seems like Ukraine is triggering a more global military escalation. How do you view what France is doing?
Well, I think it has to do with the whole history of NATO over the last 15 or 20 years. NATO was sort of an organization in search of a mission when the Soviet Union collapsed. It went out of area, was involved in Afghanistan, and all of a sudden there's this war on NATO's doorsteps. And so I think the NATO countries are actually waking up and saying, well, you know what, I think we better do something about this. And certainly every U.S. administration has talked about burden sharing and meeting the 2% GDP going towards the military. And I think the threat is real. Can I go back to the refugee question for a sec?
Sure.
We have to remember that in 2015, when the Russians started helping Bashar al-Assad in Syria, they created a refugee crisis, and it worked to their advantage. They were able to use anti-Muslim feeling in the European countries, both against the migrants and to stir up right-wing, like Marine Le Pen in France, etc. This time it's not working. I think they're hoping it's going to work by bombing the civilian infrastructure and everything. X number of Ukrainians have fled across to the Polish border or to the Hungarian border in the hopes that people will be resentful that government resources, say in Poland, are being used to help these migrants. It's not working this time. I think Emily's right that down the road there could be information tactics and everything. But right now, all the Russians seem to be doing is galvanizing public opinion against them and in favor and in support of the Ukrainian population.
So we have very little time left, but I want to ask you, it's obviously a crystal ball kind of question. If all the military might is there, if the Ukrainians were to win, what would a boxed-in Putin do? He would be boxed in. We sort of tiptoed past the conversation about, nuclear threats or veiled nuclear threats. But what would a win mean for Putin? He doesn't seem like somebody who would walk away quietly. So, Carol?
Thank you. I think we don't know. I mean, there's no answer there. We're already beginning to see cracks within Russia. The very fact that some of the fighting is being led by Mr. Prigozhin, who's Putin's buddy, the Wagner group, that's not regular Russian army, and there seems to be some skirmishing, at least verbal skirmishing, between Prigozhin and Gerasimov and Shoigu, the head of the Minister of Defense and everything. I think Putin would be afraid, but I'm not sure that there's enough unanimity among the other Russian leadership that could lead to, heaven forbid, a battlefield nuclear use or anything like that. I just don't see us getting there.
Okay. Emily, you want to dive in on that one? Or you have about 30 seconds.
I hope you're right. I think I'm inclined to agree. I mean, the potential for, some sort of power struggle within Russia, I think it actually looks more likely with some of these disagreements about who's running the military, who should be leading the fight. Putin is obviously not delivering on what he promised, and a Ukrainian victory is going to make Ukraine so much stronger. That's going to make Russia very fearful.
All right. Carol Saivetz, Emily Channell-Justice, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, as the world watches, the people of Iran are heading into their 5th month of protests sparked by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini while in custody in the country's so-called morality police, fighting against mass detentions and fierce oppression on several fronts. The protests have widened to challenge Iran's Islamic government as a whole, including its treatment of trans people. That issue is at the heart of a new film set to run here in Boston later this week as part of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston Festival of Films from Iran. This Is Not Me follows 2 trans men as they fight for legal recognition and access to gender-affirming surgery.
پسرم من همه کار میکنم که تو خوشبخت باشی.
من چرا باید از اینجا برم؟
منو دیگه هیچ وقت با این پوشش نپایید.
I'm joined now from Tehran by the film's director, Saeed Ghalipour, who's joined by his translator, Kimia. Saeed, can you tell me this is your very first film, so congratulations. What made you choose this subject?
چرا این تاپیک رو انتخاب کردی برای این فیلم؟
ببینین، اول سلام میکنم به همه شما و اینکه فیلم رو دوست داشتین و فیلم من رو انتخاب کردین. موضوعات زیادی توی ایران ساخته میشه ولی کمتر آدمایی و کمتر فیلمسازایی سراغ فیلمایی از قبیل فیلمای ترنسا و اقلیت‌های جنسیتی مثل گروه LGBT و میرن و من ترجیح دادم این موضوع انتخاب کنم چون بچه‌های LGBT و خصوصا حالا چون ترنسا تنها گروهی که اجازه دارن که و مجازن از نظر اسلام ترنس ها هستن. تا اینجا شو بگو.
First, he's thanking you for having him on and for the festival to have chosen his movie. The reason he chose this topic is because the topic of LGBT issues and trans issues is very taboo, and there aren't that many people that will choose this topic to cover this film as a filmmaker. And also because being trans is essentially the only part of LGBT that is accepted in Iran under Islamic law, and Iran is the only country that allows that sex exchange, and that's the only legal form of being gay or queer.
But in the film outlines in great detail that there are many lengths that both trans men have to go through. There are courts, there are medical checks, invasive medical checks. Neighbors are asked for their opinions. I found the most interesting, perhaps, in the film was the parents' attitude. The parents were very accepting, calling their children my son, defending them. These are very, it seems, brave stances in the face of a lot of social pressure. Let's listen to a clip where a father of one of the trans men is talking about his feelings.
بزرگتر بشی مشکلاتت بیشتر میشه. حتما ازت توضیح میخوام. هر کی برسه میشه داستان و مدعی‌الامور. اینجا جز تحقیر کوچیک شدن چیزی برات نداره. ولی اگر بری احتمالی که اون ور کمکت کنن زیاده. اونجا حداقل آدم‌ها دنبالی نیستن که ببینن تو نصف روز دختری نصف روز پسری.
حالا فرانسه به نظرتون خوبه؟
جا برات مهم نباشه. جدی میگم اصلا جا برات مهم نباشه. درسته که دلتنگ من میشی، دلتنگ مادرت میشی، سختت میشه، همه اینا رو من درک میکنم. اما
Now, Saeed, you were born post-Islamic revolution, but these parents were not. Were you surprised by the attitudes of the parents?
آیا با واکنش پدر و مادرایی که تو فیلم باشون مصاحبه کردی و واکنششون خیلی مثبت بوده، آیا این برای تعجب آور بود به عنوان کسی که بعد از انقلاب به دنیا اومده؟
ببینیم ترنس‌ها از دید تمام گروه LGBT از دید اسلام ممنوعن و حرامن، ولی بعد از انقلاب ترنس‌ها بعد از اینکه حکومت ترنس‌ها رو به رسمیت شناخت، با این حال اونا توی جامعه پذیرفته نیستن. اونا طرد میشن و مجبورن تنها زندگی کنن. خیلی از اونا مجبور مهاجرت میشن و خیلی از اونا خودکشی میکنن. و سامان و شروین دوتا کاراکتر فیلم من جز خوششانسترین ترنس‌های ایرانن که خانواده اونا رو میپذیرن و یه خانواده شگفت‌انگیزن، یعنی استثنائی‌ان و الگوی خیلی از خانواده ها شدن.
So the two families highlighted in the movie are an exception and a very, positive example of how supportive parents of trans individuals can be. That is not the case in the majority, even though legally trans individuals are accepted. As you mentioned, there are many steps. They're still ostracized by the community. Many end up committing suicide. So the two highlighted in the movie are an exception.
So, Saeed, you're a relatively recent graduate from film school in Tehran. Do you feel there have been periods of censorship in Iran for films, some stronger than others? Do you feel relatively free as a filmmaker to choose topics that you wish to talk about?
به عنوان کسی که تازه فارغ التحصیل شده از فیلم سازی، فکر میکنی که این آزادی عمل رو داری که موضوع فیلمتو انتخاب کنی توی جامعه ایران؟
بله اینجوری هست. من میتونم موضوع فیلممو انتخاب کنم، ولی اگه بخوام مجوزی برای اون فیلم بگیرم و اجازه فیلم برداری قانونی داشته باشم، باید سناریویی کار کنم که حکومت دوست داره و من هیچ دخل و تصرفی توی چیزایی که توی فیلمم قراره بگم ندارم و فقط میتونم موضوع اون رو انتخاب کنم، ولی به صورت غیرقانونی و چون من این فیلمم کاملا داوطلبانه و آزاد و بدون مجوز کار کردم و این موضوع انتخاب کردم، ولی اگه میخواستم مجوز بگیرم برای ساختش به هیچ عنوان من نمیتونستم همچین موضوعی یا موضوعات دیگه رو کار کنم.
Yes. So he can choose the topics of the movies that he wants to make, but to have it screened or have it be approved by the authorities is a whole other story. I'm not sure if you're aware, but since after the revolution, there has been a very large underground rap scene for movies, for any sorts of arts that is not essentially does not get the stamp of approval to be screened or to be sold legally. So that's essentially how he made his movie. It's an independent movie that has not been vetted by the government, is not screened anywhere. This is essentially what you're seeing is an independent artist who's passionate about the subject and his people and has made this movie completely on his own, knowing that he cannot show it anywhere in his own country.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time. Saeed, I know you have said it's the role of the filmmaker to be influential. You have, you're very young, you have a big future ahead, so we look forward to hearing more. Saeed Ghalipour, Kimia, thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
The Boston Festival of Films from Iran begins on Thursday, January 26th. This Is Not Me will be screened on Saturday, January 28th at 1 p.m. For tickets and more information, go to mfa.org. And that's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching.
Next time on